Delving into the world of Vikings, we often envision fierce, bearded warriors on raids and formidable shield maidens. However, the sagas conceal a shadow that is often overlooked. In ancient Scandinavia, being branded with the word arger could be a death sentence, and it wasn't about same-sex love itself, but about assuming a passive role. This distinction held a significance that surpassed life itself. How, then, did homosexuality manifest in Viking society? Why did some actions evoke admiration, while others led to social ruin? And what do archaeologists uncover when they excavate ancient burial sites, revealing truths buried alongside the remains? The word arger in Old Norse sounds like the strike of a blade. It denotes unmanly, but not in the modern sense. Vikings did not fear homosexuality per se. They feared submission. An active partner in same-sex relations faced no shame, while a passive one faced severe consequences: death, exile, or the loss of honor, which was valued above gold. It was not about love or attraction, but about power etched into physical form. In the medieval Icelandic law code known as Gragas, compiled 900 years ago, this was clearly regulated. Accusing a man of being arger gave him the right to challenge the accuser to a duel to the death. If the accuser refused, he had to pay compensation. However, if the accusation proved true and the man indeed assumed a passive role in a relationship with another man, he was stripped of all legal rights, inheritance, a voice at the thing, assembly, and legal protection. The community could subject him to stoning, exile, or even more brutal retribution. The sagas are replete with such conflicts. In Njál's saga, written in the 13th century but describing 10th century events, Flosi Thordarson insults Njál's sons by calling them women, implying their passive role. This accusation sparks a blood feud that leads to the burning of homes and the deaths of many. Words concerning sexual position became causes for war. The situation is complicated by the fact that the same culture that persecuted passive men praised active ones. In Lokasenna, Loki's flighting, Loki accuses Odin himself of practicing Seder magic, where he takes on a female role in the ritual. The gods do not refute the accusation, they simply change the subject. Even the Allfather could deviate from gender norms when necessary to achieve power. Archaeological findings confirm this duality. In Birka, Sweden, burial site BJ581 revealed a warrior interred with weapons and sacrificial animals. DNA analysis conducted in 2018 showed the warrior was female. The community honored her as a man in death because she lived as a man in life. Gender was determined not by biology, but by the performance of a role that could change depending on circumstances. Penetration was of key importance. Norse society drew a clear distinction between who penetrates and who is penetrated. Active partners in male-male relationships maintained their masculine status and could even gain prestige. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who observed Viking culture in 922 CE, described young male slaves kept for sexual purposes. No one doubted the master's masculinity, and the slaves had nothing to lose in terms of honor. This is also reflected in the legal codes. The frost-eating law, compiled in Norway in the 11th century, stipulated penalties for sexual insults. Accusing a man of being a mare resulted in a fine of 3 marks of silver, while accusing him of being a stallion carried no consequences. The law protected against accusations of being penetrated, not of penetrating. However, Vikings did not live in a world of strict heterosexuality. Such a concept simply did not exist. Men formed deep bonds that blurred the lines established by modern society. In Völsunga Saga, Sigurd and Gunnar make a blood brotherhood oath, mixing their blood and passing under 3 strips of turf. This ritual created a kinship more enduring than marriage. Some historians believe such bonds included sexual elements, while others suggest they were purely political. The sagas do not provide a definitive answer, but it is known that Vikings recognized relationships that went beyond simple categories. In Grettis Saga, the outlaw Grettir forms a partnership with Glamour that is described in intimate terms. They share a bed, resources, and dangers. After Glamour's death, Grettir grieves like a widow. The saga does not label this as homosexuality, but the emotional depth of this relationship transcends simple friendship. Norse mythology further complicates the picture. Loki changes between male and female forms, gives birth to children in the guise of a mare, and seduces giants by taking on a female appearance. The gods accept these metamorphoses because they serve their purposes. Loki's gender fluidity makes him powerful, not shameful. However, when he is sexually subordinate to others, the other gods ridicule him. Even in myths, the line is drawn at dominance, not gender. The reality was more complex than reflected in the laws. In the remote valleys of Iceland, men lived together for months during the long winter nights. The sagas hint at relationships that developed in isolation. In Gisla Saga, two stepbrothers share a bed for warmth and engage in sexual relations, causing a scandal in their community. The text treats this as a tragedy, not a crime. Social pressure, not legal punishment, destroys their lives. In the Viking Age, social condemnation, rather than legal prosecution, became a destructive force for those who deviated from accepted norms. Trade expeditions opened new horizons and opportunities. Scandinavian merchants embarking on voyages spent months away from home, surrounded by exclusively male crews. Arab chronicles from Cordoba provide accounts of Viking traders who brought young men with them on journeys as companions. These connections were temporary, limited to the scope of specific voyages. Upon returning home, the relationship ceased, and no one questioned what had transpired on the high seas. Some researchers believe that in the Viking mindset, there was a distinction between situational and conscious homosexuality. Men who turned to other men in the absence of women faced less condemnation than those who preferred same-sex partners when alternatives were available. This distinction was particularly important in societies where reputation played a key role in survival. Archaeological finds in Denmark, particularly in Tissø, where a complex of a large hall dating from the 6th to 11th centuries was discovered, indicate otherwise. Among the artifacts were amulets depicting men in intimate poses. These images were delicately crafted and carried no mocking undertones. They were made with the same care as fertility symbols. Evidently, these items were of great value as they were buried with precious objects. The finds at Tissø suggest that sexual diversity could coexist with social restrictions. Elite Vikings may have practiced homosexuality in private while observing public taboos. Power granted privileges, allowing them to break rules that could lead to tragedy for commoners. Jarls and kings could afford to cross boundaries for which slaves paid with their lives. Scandinavian women added even more color to the overall picture. Sagas describe masculine women who participated in battles, led raids, and rejected marriage. Freydis Eiríksdóttir, for example, led her own expedition to Vinland and personally dealt with enemies. Yet her femininity was never questioned, although she was described in masculine terms. She took an active role in violence, traditionally considered a male prerogative. Some of these women may have had relationships with other women. Evidence is scarce, but it exists. Laxdæla Saga tells of two women whose friendship was so close that it aroused jealousy in their husbands. They shared secrets, resources, and what the text calls a special attachment. The saga presents their bond as something natural and even admirable. However, female homosexuality faced different restrictions than male homosexuality. Scandinavian law punished men for passive roles but completely ignored female sexuality. Women had nothing to lose, as they could not inherit property or participate in the thing anyway. Sexual or transgressions cost them less because they possessed fewer rights. This created a space for relationships unavailable to men. In the sagas, female friendship is described in minute detail, shared beds, secrets, and emotional bonds that lasted for decades. Some historians interpret this as veiled lesbian relationships, while others see it as an expression of intense platonic connection in a culture with clear gender segregation. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Vikings lived in a world where survival mattered more than sexual categories. People formed the relationships they needed, whether for warmth, protection, camaraderie, or love. Society judged by results, not by means. With the arrival of Christianity, everything changed. In the 10th and 11th centuries, Scandinavian culture embraced Christianity, bringing with it new sexual norms. The Christian Church declared all homosexual acts a sin, not just passive ones. This created a more rigid framework than what existed in traditional Scandinavian culture. However, the Christianization of Iceland occurred gradually. The Althing voted to adopt Christianity in 1000 CE, but old customs persisted for generations. Sagas, written by Christian authors in the 13th and 14th centuries, preserved memories of pre-Christian morals. They describe homosexual relationships with a certain complexity rather than simply condemning them. Some Scandinavian Christians found ways to combine old and new values. They accepted Christian teachings on sexual sin while retaining Scandinavian notions of honor and dominance. The result was a hybrid culture that punished sexual submission but showed tolerance for other forms of same-sex intimacy. Archaeological finds in Christianized Scandinavia demonstrate this contradiction. In 11th century burials, both Christian crosses and pagan sexual amulets are found. People buried their dead with symbols from both worlds, as if hedging their bets on which afterlife awaited them. Conversion to Christianity also influenced how Vikings spoke about homosexuality. Pre-Christian texts used specific terms such as arga and strodine, which emphasized the sexual role. Sagas written under Christian influence use more vague formulations, describing relationships as unnatural or contrary to God's will. The precision of the old terminology gave way to moral generalizations. However, old attitudes continued to exist in a hidden form. Icelandic law continued to punish accusations of passive homosexuality even after Christianization. The legal tradition preserved Scandinavian distinctions despite contradictions with Christian teachings. Men could still dispute sexual insults through duels, holmgang, in the 13th century, 600 years after the start of Christianization. Over time, with the spread of Christianity, Viking sexual mores underwent significant changes, though this process was not uniform. Regional differences played an important role. Danish Vikings, in close contact with Christian Europe, adapted more quickly to new sexual norms. At the same time, Norwegian Vikings, living in remote valleys, retained traditional customs longer. Swedes, in turn, developed hybrid approaches, combining Christian and pagan elements. Iceland, due to its geographical isolation, preserved the most complete information about pre-Christian customs in its sagas and laws. Trade routes also influenced the spread of both acceptance and restrictions in the sexual sphere. Vikings who visited Constantinople became acquainted with Byzantine Christianity and its teachings on sexuality, while traders interacting with the Islamic world encountered entirely different moral codes. The most cosmopolitan Vikings learned to navigate various sexual systems, adapting to the demands of different markets. Some became stricter in their views than traditional Scandinavian culture required, seeking to make a favorable impression on Christian trading partners and avoid the risk of losing valuable business connections due to sexual freedom. Others, conversely, used travel as an opportunity to escape the restrictions that existed in their homelands. The available evidence indicates that homosexuality in the Viking Age was a widespread, complex, and conditional phenomenon. Same-sex relationships between men and women could arise for various reasons, including love, the pursuit of power, the need for survival, and convenience. Society evaluated these relationships based on the roles partners played, not just their actions. Active partners retained their status, while passive ones lost it. Women faced fewer restrictions, but also fewer opportunities. It is important to note that Vikings did not think in terms of modern sexual orientation. For them, honor, dominance, the preservation of family lines, and the survival of the community were of greater importance. An individual's sexual preferences were secondary if they could successfully fight, lead, and maintain their social status. Slavery reveals another facet of Viking sexual culture. In Hedeby, a major trading hub on the border between Denmark and Germany, 9th-century Arab coins were used to pay for human cargo, particularly young men and boys, who were in high demand in Islamic markets. Vikings involved in selling slaves were well aware of the reasons for this demand. Ibn Rusta described how Scandinavian traders selected the most attractive male slaves for specific buyers, with beauty increasing the slave's value and virginity doubling it. These transactions represented not only trade, but also cultural exchange. Viking traders adopted Islamic ideas about male beauty and same-sex relationships. In cities like Baghdad and Cordoba, influential men openly had male lovers. Some Vikings adopted these customs, bringing young male slaves home not only as workers, but also as companions. Archaeological finds confirm this. In Kaupang, Norway, remains of a 9th-century trading house were discovered, including Islamic glass vessels, Byzantine silk, and ornaments intended for young men. The owner of this house not only displayed his wealth, but also offered certain services, having male slaves at his disposal who were trained for more than just physical labor. The legal codes of the time testify to the complexity of these relationships. The Gulating law from Western Norway, compiled in the 11th century, established different punishments for sexual violence depending on the victim's status. The rape of a free woman was punishable by a fine of 40 marks, the rape of a slave woman by 4 marks, while no punishment was stipulated for the rape of a male slave. The law implied that male slaves were available for sexual use by their masters, thus creating a class of people outside the usual codes of honor. Male slaves from Ireland, Scotland, and the Baltic did not have male status to protect, and their masters could use them sexually without fear of losing face. As they grew older, some of these slaves gained freedom for their service, while others remained in sexual slavery for life. The adoption of Christianity added further complexity to these relationships, as church laws condemned all homosexual acts, including those committed with slaves. However, economic considerations counteracted this, and Viking traders who abandoned the lucrative slave trade faced financial ruin. Many found a compromise by selling slaves abroad to maintain their Christian reputation at home. Burial rites also shed light on Viking sexual culture. At Gamla Uppsala, Sweden, paired male burials were discovered in large 6th-century mounds. The men were buried with identical weapons, shared grave goods, and in poses that suggest intimate relationships. These were not master and slave, but equals. Similar paired burials are found in other parts of Scandinavia. In Birka, a 951 CE grave was found containing 2 men holding hands. Their weapons were identical, their ornaments complemented each other, and similar battle scars were found on their bones. They lived as warriors, fought as partners, and died together. The community honored their bond by burying them as a single entity. Love and sexuality in the Viking Age is a complex and multifaceted topic that continues to spark debate among historians and archaeologists. Evidence of homosexual relationships in Scandinavia during that era is contradictory and often interpreted differently. Not all same-sex relationships left their mark on history. Poor Vikings, such as slaves, freedmen, and landless warriors, were buried in unmarked graves that have disappeared over the time. Their stories of love and loss vanished with their bones. Only the wealthy left material evidence for archaeologists. This social bias influences our understanding of Viking sexuality. Information about relationships among the elite is found in sagas and rich burials, while relationships among common people remain in the shadows. Thus, the homosexuality we can infer was predominantly aristocratic, which creates a distorted view of Scandinavian sexual culture. Regional differences also add complexity. In Denmark, located closer to Christian Europe, same-sex relationships faced restrictions earlier. King Harald Bluetooth, who ruled from 958 to 987, promoted Christian values, including sexual abstinence. However, archaeological data from his reign indicates a continued acceptance of diverse relationships among the nobility. In Norway, the situation developed differently. King Olaf Tryggvason, who ruled from 995 to 1000, imposed Christianity by force. He burned temples, executed pagan priests, and banned traditional customs. But even he could not instantly change people's personal behavior. Sagas tell of his court, where men secretly maintained same-sex relationships. Sweden remained pagan the longest and preserved older sexual mores. In Gamla Uppsala, ritual homosexuality continued until the 11th century. Adam of Bremen, writing around 1070, described ceremonies where men took passive roles as a sign of reverence for the gods. Christian observers considered these practices abhorrent, but Swedish participants saw them as a sacred duty. Iceland offers the most comprehensive picture due to the abundance of preserved sources. The island's isolated location shielded it from rapid cultural shifts, allowing older customs to persist longer and be meticulously recorded by medieval writers. Icelandic sagas contain the richest descriptions of same-sex relationships in medieval literature. However, even these Icelandic accounts are filtered through Christian authors who wrote centuries after the events they describe. These writers had complex motivations. They preserved family histories while simultaneously conforming to church doctrine. They included homosexual relationships in their stories, but often presented them as tragic or unnatural. As a result, we have sources that both reveal and conceal. The sagas describe same-sex intimacy in vivid detail, only to condemn it as sinful or destructive. Readers must decipher these contradictory messages to understand the culture of that era. Archaeological chemistry provides more precise evidence. Analysis of bones from Scandinavian burials reveals dietary patterns that indicate domestic arrangements. Men buried together often show similar isotopic signatures, suggesting they consumed the same foods for years. This points to long-term domestic partnerships rather than casual encounters. DNA analysis adds another layer of information. Genetic testing of paired male burials sometimes reveals kinship ties, brothers, cousins, or father and son buried together. In other cases, however, the men are unrelated. They chose to live and die as family, despite lacking blood ties. These voluntary bonds could have included sexual relationships. Textile analysis also tells a story. Viking-age male burials sometimes contain silk ribbons, jewelry, and decorative items typically associated with women. These men were buried with feminine objects because they fulfilled feminine roles in life. Their communities accepted this gender crossing to such an extent that they honored it even after death. The Oseberg ship burial, dated to 834 AD, presents a puzzle. Two women were interred with the richest grave goods ever found in Scandinavia. One was elderly, likely a queen. The other was younger, possibly a servant or companion. However, their positions in the burial and shared items suggest a more intimate relationship. If these women were lovers, their burial represents the highest status evidence of lesbian relationships in Viking archaeology. The younger woman may have been sacrificed to accompany her partner into the afterlife, indicating a bond stronger than a political alliance. Nevertheless, this interpretation remains controversial among scholars who prefer less sexual explanations. Poetry preserves customs that laws and sagas conceal. In Havamal, one of the oldest Norse poems, Odin offers advice on relationships to young men. He warns against trusting women but says nothing negative about male partnerships. This silence can speak louder than condemnation. Skaldic poetry from the 10th and 11th centuries contains veiled references to same-sex relationships. Poets used metaphors and wordplay to discuss forbidden topics. A warrior described as a bedmate of the sword-bearer might have been more than just a battle companion. These verses circulated in royal courts where direct speech could be dangerous. Legal evidence becomes clearer upon close examination. Gragas outlines detailed procedures for prosecuting sexual offenses, but the laws primarily concern relationships between men, with almost no mention of relationships between women. This could mean that lesbian relationships were either not considered criminal or not deemed significant enough to regulate. Marriage laws reveal even greater complexity. Norse marriages were primarily economic and political agreements. Love was secondary to land deals and family alliances, creating space for emotional and sexual relationships outside of marriage. Both men and women could have same-sex lovers while fulfilling marital obligations. Divorce laws further support this interpretation. Women could divorce their husbands for refusing sex, but also for being excessively sexually demanding. The Viking Age, a time of stern customs and unyielding will, placed particular demands on human nature. Sexuality, like other aspects of life, was subject to strict laws of honor and power. The law of the time recognized the importance of sexual satisfaction, but did not take it for granted. Matters of intimate life were subject to discussion and regulation. If a marriage did not provide the desired satisfaction, society allowed for the possibility of seeking it elsewhere. The concept of honor, like an invisible thread, permeated all sexual relationships, defining the boundaries of what was permissible and forbidden. A man's honor depended directly on his ability to protect his family, lead his followers, and achieve victory over his enemies. Sexual behavior was relevant only to the extent that it could affect the performance of these vital functions. Passive homosexuality, for instance, was perceived as a sign of weakness, capable of undermining a leader's authority. At the same time, active homosexuality could be seen as a display of dominance and strength, which, on the contrary, reinforced his position. However, this system of honor was not uniform for everyone. Different rules and expectations existed for members of various social strata. Jarls and kings, possessing greater power, also had more honor to lose, but simultaneously their power gave them more opportunities to protect it. A king noted for same-sex affairs might face gossip and rumors, but rarely an open challenge. In contrast, a poor farmer who indulged in similar behavior risked being ostracized from the community or even losing his life. Thus, power granted sexual freedom unavailable to those who were weak and defenseless. Recent archaeological excavations in Repton, England, have provided new evidence about Viking sexual customs. In a mass grave from 873 AD, among the remains of 264 bodies, forensic analysis revealed signs of same-sex partnerships. Some skeletons were found in embracing poses, others with shared grave goods, indicating intimate closeness between these individuals. Among the Vikings who fell in battle for England were couples that a modern person would easily recognize. However, the Vikings themselves likely would not have understood modern categories and definitions. For them, these were simply people who lived, fought, and died together. Love, which in later eras was forced to hide and not speak its name aloud, was a natural part of life for them. Honor and courage were paramount, and everything else was merely fleeting noise in the wind.